It is extraordinary that like a girl is still used daily as an insult. Girls growing up hearing that, I'm sure they internalise it. So I coined that phrase for our film to reclaim it so that young girls would say to do something like a girl means to win.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and welcome to the No Filter podcast, where I chat to people who have a story to tell. Rachel Griffiths is a storyteller, and she's everything that you hope she'll be and more. When you meet her, like I did this week for the first time, she's like a combination of her Muriel's wedding character, remember Rhonda, and herself. And within moments, I found myself calling her Rach, and she didn't seem to mind. Rachel Griffiths is spunky, feisty, compassionate, commanding, funny, and unmistakably Aussie. Which is why a few years ago, she decided to uproot her family, husband Andrew Taylor, he's an artist, and their 3 kids who are now 15, 13 and 11, and come home to Australia. Rachel has been telling stories for the past 25 years of her life in iconic movies like Muriel's Wedding and cult TV shows like 6 Feet Under and Brothers and Sisters. Rachel Griffiths has built her career out of playing really interesting characters. She's rarely the flashy lead role. She's more often the interesting support character. But now she's decided to play herself in an entirely new role, filmmaker and director. It all started when Rachel was at a barbecue on Melbourne Cup Day back in 2015. She was half-heartedly watching the race, surrounded by girlfriends, when she heard this.
Prince of Penzance coming on down the outside. Prince of Penzance for Michelle Payne. Now Max Dynamite starts to charge home. Prince of Penzance from Max Dynamite. Prince of Penzance, it's history at Flemington, Michelle Payne. Prince of Penzance.
Like so many of us that day, Rachel's ears pricked up to hear a woman's name called. And what happened next went down in history. Michelle Payne became the first ever female jockey to win the Melbourne Cup, and Rachel knew in that instant that she had to turn this story into a film. Fast forward 4 years and Rachel has directed her first film, that film in fact. It's called Ride Like a Girl. It's about Michelle Payne, and my God, it is brilliant. On this episode of No Filter, Rachel and I cover a lot of ground. From Hollywood to her relationship with her father, to playing spiky characters, to becoming a director, to dark nights of the soul and imposter syndrome, to her kids, self-confidence, to moving back to Australia, there is a lot here. And I promise you we don't speak that fast. I hope that you enjoy listening to my new friend Rach as much as I enjoyed talking to her. Here's Rachel Griffiths. So it all began on Melbourne Cup Day 2015. I bet you didn't wake up that day knowing that the next 4 years of your life we're going to change.
No, I guess I was like Michelle like that, though she says she was a bit more confident. No, look, I came back from America really hoping to step up to be a content maker.
Why did you come back? Because you were at the top of your game for 10 years, A-list in Hollywood.
I did feel, a bit imposter that I was always telling American stories. I loved the people I was working with. I loved the content. I loved the acting work I was doing. But in some ways, becoming an internationally successful actor was a kind of a funny thing that happened on the way to the forum because, I didn't get into any of the top acting schools. I got into a ratbag little college called Rusden, which is now Deakin. It was a 4-year course that was multimedia. I did a triple major, dance, design and drama. And then at the end you get your Bachelor of Education. A lot of people that came out of there have gone on to be content makers because we were always group devising, making work. None of us had that kind of sense that the agents, would be coming to show day and would be off to America. We always thought we'd be making our own opportunities. And then my first job at the Woolly Jumpers Theatre for Schools, based in Geelong, was very much in that kind of group devised, planning the following year's work. It was a collective. We had wonderful relationships with different collaborators. So I think I assumed I'd be a content maker. And in fact, why I left Melbourne University and went to Rusden was because the intellectual passions that I was, ignited by at university, I didn't feel just writing essays was so disheartening and kind of not fun. So I wanted to take the ideas and the things I was writing about and find a more collaborative place for those to express themselves, which at the time I think I told myself might be documentaries or, when I went off. But after a year, I definitely wanted to be a performer and basically said until I'm 30 I'll commit to being an actor because it's not a decision you make later. But you just get to the kind of point, I think, as an actor, particularly in television, where you get paid a huge amount of money, but the door's not open for the knock.
What does that mean?
Well, if you have ideas about the character or, feelings about where the story's going that you might not love or have some great ideas for stories, there is a sense you are the below the line. You're down there on the production.
You're the talent.
You're the talent, but you're not the intellectual talent. The intellectual talent are the writer-producers.
Because the talent is actually often used quite disparagingly, isn't it?
Within television, there was this kind of legacy that, you clocked on, clocked off, and, you turned up where you were told, and your opinions were not particularly valued. And I got to the point where I didn't want to be under contract again, so I'd been under 2 7-year contracts. They both were 5 years, which were wonderful. I was able to keep my young family in one place for a decade.
Is that why actors like doing television, even though the hours are incredibly long, aren't they?
Well, if you're in an ensemble, you're unlikely to be 5 days. So, on 6 Feet Under, often I was 2.5 days, sometimes 3. On Brothers and Sisters, the schedules of how we used to started with 2 weeks an episode, and I think we ended up getting down to 7 days with an overlap. So, look, either I'd work 5 days that weren't hideously long because I was kind of famous for being great at 6 a.m. and pretty much cooked by 6 p.m. So I would, be able to get home and tuck my kids in. But, look, particularly for women, mothers make that choice to go into television because it does keep you in one place and provides you with weekends and a predictable annual schedule that actually coincides with the American holidays. So if you're on a network show, you're on holidays when your kids are, which is
helpful.
Pretty helpful.
Do you get itchy feet creatively when you're on a show for that long?
Look, no, because as I said, because I had a young family, I had my hands full. I was contractually, privileged to have the opportunity to direct on Brothers and Sisters, but I ended up having my 3rd child and had a very difficult birth and recovery from that, and just didn't feel it was something, unfortunately, that I could take on.
So the decision to come home, did Australia feel small?
No, it didn't. The thing was, to not be under contract meant that I could be working anywhere in the world, and I didn't want my family in LA while I was working anywhere in the world. So the minute I said I want 5 years without being on a contract, which I did almost to the day, then I did a TV pilot which didn't get picked up, which was great because that was New York, and had it got picked up, we would have had to move back to New York. No, it didn't. It felt wonderful coming home. I just really missed things like not having a mother's group. I had felt quite isolated being a mother with, 3 under 5 without those supports that, your girlfriends you've had since primary school, are there for you to have a wine.
There's a big expat community in Hollywood though, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, but they're not, everybody's got their own schedules and I think, with my husband and I, we connect a lot more, I think, because of him, and he was a trailing spouse. We really connected with the visual art world there, which was actually really exciting for me. We were involved in multiple cultural institutions and on their kind of, young circle donors, and that really opened up LA beyond that film industry part. But it was more important in the off time, I think, to have Andrew connected to a friendship group. And I had such close relationships with my co-workers that I didn't necessarily, and also just acting, if you are doing those 16-hour days, you're not really feeling terribly social, And it's not the same as just those girls you've known since grade 5, you know, that have gone through everything with you and know your dog's name that you had when you were a kid.
Yeah,
and
there's
they
something
know,
very powerful. And know your parents. They always ask about your parents.
They know your parents, and they know that old phone number.
Yes.
They know the old landline.
Yes.
We laugh about it.
It's so true. You were always a critically acclaimed, incredibly well-respected, award-winning actress. But it's a conversation I've had with Richard Roxburgh as well. You weren't like a celebrity in that modern form of people who become celebrities as something outside their work. Was that a conscious choice?
No,
from
I
you?
just think I'm just not an it girl. Do you know what I mean? I do think some people just kind of attract you know, whatever it is about, you know, them in the moment and their beauty or their charisma or their specialness in a certain way. I think I'm a little bit odd. I think I've taken a long time to grow into who I am. You know,
how old are you now?
51.
It's nice, isn't it?
It's nice.
I'm 40. I'm going to be 48 in a minute. Like, it's nice.
So, you know, sometimes I think, look, I was directing at 50. My first feature, and it was a bit if not now when. But I think that's also true. Just many women don't feel like they grow into themselves, you know.
Well, in Hollywood, I imagine it's all about staying eternally young.
Yeah, but look, I do think there are just girls. One thing I've noticed is I think if girls have extraordinary fathers who believe in them and tell them that they can do anything, which girls like Scarlett Johansson and Uma Thurman and Gwyneth Paltrow had those dads. I think, and Michelle Payne had one of those fathers that said, "You're as good as the boys. You just need the opportunities." And I think girls that grow up with that kind of dad, I think they arrive really young because it is in the kind of rainbow that a good man casts that I think you feel the confidence to go into the world. I think it gives you a huge amount of a bulwark against negative messages from men, against harassment, because you can kind of go back to daddy and go, this happened, and, you know, dad's like, where is he? I'll deck him, you know, and you just feel that emboldenedness. So, you know, I didn't have that, and I think it did take a long time, as you say, imposter syndrome. You know, I'm doing everything I hoped and wanted to do, and yet I was always afraid, you know, I'd never maybe pull off.
They say that girls get their self-confidence from their mothers and their self-esteem from their fathers. And since I've heard that, it's really resonated with me, with friends, and I had one of those dads, but friends that I know who didn't. It's a tougher road.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
And Michelle did, as you say.
She did. My father left our family when I was 11 years old. He failed to economically provide for my mother and my two brothers. He was extremely random and unreliable in any correspondence. And I do think, you know, that, you know, there's a shame wound, I think, that happens when you are abandoned or discarded at that age, and I think you do kind of internalise that. And it's not, you know, it's not as black and white. Say, oh, my dad left me because I'm not worth anything. But you think, well, I mustn't really be that much chop.
Yeah, I imagine you internalise a lot. So you came home wanting to tell Australian stories.
I did.
Did you know where the story was? Elizabeth Gilbert has that thing about ideas sort of fly around the universe, and they're looking for someone, a receptacle. Yeah,
so I do think it chose me. I didn't choose it, but that's also how my brain works. You know, I can just really get ignited in an incredibly myopic way. Maybe I'm on some kind of spectrum, but when the lights go on, I cannot turn them off, and I can't turn the noise down, and the chatter and the extrapolation and the questions that just start bombarding, you know, and it hasn't happened kind of very many times in my life. It happened when I read the script for Muriel's wedding. That was one of those moments where, you know, I felt that was the first time I read content that I thought, I am the best person to play this. I understand this girl. No one else can do this. As you know, it will bring what I can bring to this. And it happened when I read Hilary and Jackie, and it happened when I read the pilot for 6 Feet Under. They're probably the only 3 times in my career, even as an actor, my brain just can't stop thinking about the project and immediately starts thinking about the character and the questions and drawing the architecture from, A to Z that the character might go through. But I've had, when I was at university, and I studied politics, and I came across Anne Summers, and that was one of those moments, that my brain woke up to, not just kind of feminism, but, historical, sociological roots of how different countries treat, view, value their women. And that is, finally found a place to rest in Total Control, which is the show I co-created with Darren Dale and Miranda Deer with Blackfella Films, starring Deborah Malman, coming to ABC mid-October.
That sounds amazing. That's you playing a Prime Minister.
I play a Conservative Prime Minister, female, but she's in a Theresa May. She's trying to hold the broad church against the fracturing of the hard right. She helicopters in an Indigenous girl to the Senate who brings down the government. But it's a, extraordinarily complex and very timely and relevant contemplation of the role of the outsider in politics. Is the outsider what's going to renew democracy, or is the outsider democracy's biggest threat? We talk about popularism, we look at sexism and racism within the power structures, and of course from the Indigenous perspective of how do black fellas do politics in white fella politics while still building the bridges they need to get consensus in their own. Very, very complicated. And also it is a kind of parliamentary procedural thriller in the way that the last 2 weeks of Brexit have been, where all the dusty old rule books and the Constitution, which we're all, coming across these new terms, like is it
prorogue? I can't even know how to say it.
What clause of the parliamentary dusty rule book we haven't prorogued in the atypical as a strategy for a kind of power grab for several hundred years. So it's really dealing with everything that is facing our democracies. So that comes that comes from my brain, back in the day being exploded. By awakening, I think, to certain concepts.
The barbecue. Australia Day.
Yeah. No, Melbourne Cup Day.
Sorry, Melbourne Cup Day. Do you know, it's funny, I'll get to that later, but in terms of days that have become, for some people in some ways, problematic, that used to be very simple in terms of how we celebrated them. But let's park that for a second. I want to know how your Melbourne Cup Day in 2015 unfolded.
So I'd come back. I did have another coming-of-age story that I had a fabulous script for and was also very expensive, and I just could not get this film made. And Joel Perlman from Village, I had a meeting with him and he said, look, Rach, the thing is, if you want to make an Australian film, especially of this budget, you need to find an Australian heroine that Australians are going to root for, as they say in America, like really walk in the shoes of, want for her what she wants for herself. And he said, I'm sorry, but this script, this heroine isn't that. So that kind of stayed with me, and I was reading, other scripts that were coming to me to attach as a director. None of them were funded. And look, I knew it was going to be 4 years of my life, so it had to be something really passionate about. The other film was set in the world of modelling, and it really was going to be for kind of girls, 12 to probably 40, and was about a young woman's journey through a world in which, people are defining her through very negative stereotype terms because it's the modelling world, and she ends up reclaiming that and self-defining. It's kind of Cara Delevingne, heroine story. And I really loved a lot of the themes in it about female empowerment and staring down the haters and that idea of self-defining. So there I was at the barbecue, not really interested in racing. I hate all the palaver of dressing up and getting rained on at the Melbourne Cup. And I don't know what horse I had, but we were in there, and because it was one of those parties where all the husbands were painters And apparently because of the methylated spirits or the terps, they rarely have males. So there were like 14 girls at the barbecue and only one male, which was hilarious. And then, the 200 mark, Bruce Miles mentions Michelle Payne.
Prince of Penzance coming on down the outside. Prince of Penzance for Michelle Payne.
And the 300 he clocked the horse. At the 200 he said Michelle Payne, Prince of Penzance. And I just said, is there a girl in this race? Girls jockeys? And it just blew my mind that of all the sports in the world that men and women can play on equal playing field, that it's the most dangerous. I have been corrected, lawn bowls, but also equally dangerous for the heart attacks that happen back in the clubhouse after a long day out there in the sun.
Very perilous.
Very perilous. And, my brain just fires. It goes, what kind of woman would want to do that?
Yeah.
What kind of woman would it take to be the first? And then it was just it did not surprise me that she was the youngest of 10. It didn't surprise me that she'd had 8 jockeys in the family, that her father was a trainer. I think all those things are required, for a girl to break through, that she had a father that told her from the youngest age that she was as good as the boys, she just needed the opportunities. And then the more I learned about, the family, and of course we meet Stevie,
her brother with Down syndrome.
And he was obviously a hugely important part of that day for, the glass ceiling that Michelle broke for many Australians and people around the world that have someone in their family who's underestimated because of a so-called disability. That day was really a watershed moment because there is a man at the top of his profession in charge of millions of dollars worth of horseflesh. And the role model, the beacon. I mean, they say you can't be what you can't see. And that day, 2 different groups saw themselves on the stage beating the world.
And then she took her helmet off and spoke into the microphone.
Yes, and then so I was already in love, but then when she said get stuffed.
Just want to say to everyone else can get stuffed because they think women aren't strong enough, but we just beat the world.
And it was funny because she got so much flack for that. And if you listen to it back now, it's like Bambi saying it.
It's so tame.
It's so tame and it's so cute. She's just like, anyone that doesn't think, women aren't good enough, well, they can get stuffed. It's just like so adorable. Like I wished I could swear so adorably.
Yeah. And then what happens next? How do you go from that tingly feeling of I've got to tell this story, this is it, this is the one? What happens next?
So I called a producer, Richard Keddy, who had been trying to get up the Julie Gillard project that I'd also pitched. And I said, did you just watch that win? I said, we've got to make this film. It's going to be a PG feminist sports film that'll make men cry.
Lofty aims.
Well, I love movies that make men cry.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you can change men by shaming them. My theory in life is you can only change men by making them cry or denying or giving them sex. And that's pretty much the only thing that will swing a man's mind around.
I think that's genius. And this was the one. And then you needed Michelle's permission.
Yes, we couldn't get any answers. So it was about a month that we hadn't heard back from the management. I was starting to get very despondent.
But you're Rachel Griffiths. Like,
no,
who doesn't call you back?
I was not getting calls back. And in a way that was good because it just made me hungrier. And I had a girlfriend ring and say, Michelle's going to be up doing a photo line up at Randwick. So I got on a plane. I flew up. I waited in a queue for an hour and a half for a photo with Michelle. I sidled up and said, hi, I'm Rachel Griffiths. I want to make your story. I promise you I'm going to make an inspirational story for girls around the world. And I promise that I'll watch it with your whole family and they won't want to punch me in the face. Then I had arranged quite secretly to be on the next table to her in Chairman's. So then I sidled up for a second crack, getting really creepy now, to hit on Kathy and Therese, who, whose entire racing stats I was already
over. Who are Kathy and Therese?
So Payne. So Kathy's married to Kerry McAvoy, but had a...
He's a jockey?
He might be like Australia's top jockey.
I don't know racing things.
The amazing thing, so Kathy and Therese were there that day probably because both their husbands were riding. But in the Melbourne Cup... Michelle was riding against 2 of her brother-in-laws and could have been third, but because there's a third, but I think he got scratched. So, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So, you know, I had all of Kathy and Teresa's stats. I knew that Teresa had been the first woman to win the Bendigo Cup. Kathy had ridden some, you know, Group 1s and Group 2s and had a, you know, really great career. She was a very good rider before she retired to have her family. I mean, it's a dynasty. It's just one of those things like the Barrymores, you know. Racing is usually, I think, a love passed on between father and son or father and daughter in terms, you know, Gay Waterhouse is a great example of that. It's a culture, I think, if you grow up in, it's, you know, it's hard to break out of. Margaret Payne is an accountant. She does everybody's taxes. Thank God they've got one.
What was the moment that you got the final okay from Michelle?
It was almost Christmas Eve. You know, look, her management, there was some pretty big offers on the table. You know, there are Americans interested, and I think the risk there is you can end up in development hell and, you know, the story never comes to the screen. Those projects can just sit on shelves.
Did you feel like you were auditioning?
Oh, 100%. No, I mean...
Is that a mode that you can just click into?
Only if I'm truly... I can't fake it. I cannot fake it. And, you know, we raised $5 million private equity. Susie Montague, my co-producer, who's got deep connections in the horse industry, she and I raised most of the private equity. And you just can't sit in front of Katie Page Harvey, who is, you know, our first angel investor that came on board.
From wife of Harvey
Well,
Norman.
More importantly, CEO.
Yeah,
she is
true.
The CEO of Harvey Norman.
She controls, you're absolutely right to correct me, she controls an enormous amount of advertising revenue and just money from that family.
Yeah, and it's a huge, you know, international business that she has been running at an extraordinary level against, you know, massive competition. And of course, she's got the Magic Millions, and she's huge, you know, hugely supportive of women in sport.
So lots of female angel investors.
The women football, yes, and some, you know, also some wonderful men like Neil Werrett, you know, the owners of Black Caviar, Bruce Neal from Tasmania, who's got a big horse stud up near Scone, and you know, really wonderful. A mix of women who are very much supportive of the women, and also men who are equally supportive of, you know, the inroads that girls are making.
Then is the next decision who you cast as Michelle? Or what is directing?
No, the next decision is getting your writers. Okay. So although this was a girl's story, it's in a man's world, so I felt I needed a male writer, and I approached Andrew Knight. He felt it needed a girl, and I said, yeah, but a girl's not going to write for Paddy, a girl's not going to write for these trainers, a girl's not going to write, you know, the world.
Do films only have one writer?
No, well, he suggested that he co-write with Elise McCready, who just did Stateless as her first showrunner show, and of course I think she won the actor for Sunshine. She's a fabulous talent. She has a child with a profound disability herself. And the script that they wrote was just, you know, look, it was an extraordinary document. It was a bit like Don't Fuck It Up. Everybody read it that just said it was those two voices coming together, the male and female voices kind of in tension, in play, sometimes very comfortably, you know, Andrew wrote the kind of Dad and Dave scenes beautifully between Paddy and Stevie, and then the kind of feisty terrier, you know, voice is Elise. I was also very fortunate that Elise was watching rushes, which is highly unusual for a writer.
What's a rush?
Just the dailies. And she was like, oh my God, Stevie, we didn't write for Stevie to what he can do. And she pitched 3 more scenes, which we added somehow to the schedule that, you know, elevated his role in the film and brings, you know, a big spark of joy constantly.
The decision to cast Stevie in real life as Stevie in the film.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, first, Teresa Palmer was my first choice for Michelle.
What did you know her from?
I'd met her personally. She was beautiful in Hacksaw Ridge. I loved her in Warm Bodies. I saw her in a film called Berlin Syndrome, where she basically is abused for 2 hours. And just the combination of her surrender to her, director and the requirements of the role just showed such physical and emotional commitment. And then in the other, she's often cast just to make the man look more human, make sponge cake of crumbs. And I thought she's never had a true hero's journey. She's never had a journey with that real architecture that a solid hero construction can allow you.
A young, beautiful blonde woman in Hollywood must be a difficult terrain to navigate.
Yeah, I don't think she's been taken seriously.
Yeah.
I think not being beautiful, they were like, well, she's not beautiful, so she must be an actor. But I think if you are beautiful, and Charlize Theron and had to go the full ugly to go, actually, she's not relying on her looks. Yeah. Now she can do both. She can be stunning and act. But I think, Teresa, I think she's really, really underestimated. But I wanted to cast a woman who men adored, because I thought if I cast a kind of a spiky girl, I wouldn't bring the men on the journey. And
it's funny you use that word, because when I was reading Jocelyn Morehouse's memoir recently about casting Muriel's wedding, and she talked about how they'd originally thought of your character as being a sort of a larger, more overweight, sort of softer character, and then you came in and you were so spiky. I think she even used the word spiky.
Yeah, I'm spiky.
And she said straight away we knew that it was going to be Rachel. So it's almost like it's a quality that you're familiar with.
Yes, and men don't always walk in my shoes, and I know that as a performer. Gay men adore me, and women
Straight
do.
women adore you.
Straight women adore me. Gay women adore me too.
You.
All women adore me. No, because I think the unconventional notes I play ring true to certain women, I remember on 6 Feet Under, Peter Krause he literally drove across America back to do season 4. Season 3 I'd been a bit out of control, or season 2 I'd been out of control. He's in the middle of nowhere on Route 66 and he's refilling up his convertible Mustang that he's driving over with a mate. And this guy came up came out of the desert under a rock next to a scorpion and said, "Hey, you're that guy. You're that guy on that Dead show." And then he comes right up to him. He goes, "What are you going to do with your girlfriend? She's a fucking nut job. Are you going to kill her?" And he acted this out. "She's a fucking bitch. You got to kill her, man." So, yeah, that's the kind of shit I get.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Did you have to fight for Teresa?
A little bit. Because she doesn't trigger the big international money that, look, very few girls do. I think, here probably Margot, Nicole, Rose Byrne, Annie Hemsworth triggers those internet, which are basically
any old Hemsworth.
You can sell the world off pre-sale, and then you're basically out of trouble. But
Teresa Palmer didn't have that cachet at that time.
Well, no, she does have a cachet. Look, there is honestly
not to that level, though.
There is like probably 20 girls in the world who you can fully finance a picture.
Bankable. Is that what it comes down to?
It's the pre-sales.
It's who you have as the star when the people are deciding to invest, or is it when you're selling to overseas markets?
Well, if you're trying to, cover the film in pre-sales, like, for example, Lion was pre-sold at Cannes with Dev and Nicole Kidman.
Before it was made.
On
the basis of their names.
Here's the poster, here's the book, here's the title, here's the pitch, here's Dev, Nicole, $18 million pre-sales, every territory done. You can go and make your movie. No one's going to be out of pocket. So I did, I was, told, let's look at Emma Thompson, let's look at Claire Foy. But I knew it. I just knew it was going to be Teresa. And I've had, a very similar thing with Hillary and Jackie, where I did not trigger, enough pre-sales, and there was a lot of pressure. And I think at some point they were trying to get Courtney Love, who had already stolen my lead role in the People versus Larry Flint when it was down to Courtney and me. So I had to really, really fight for that. But my director fought for me. But it was just such a quintessential Australian film.
Did you have to fight for Teresa?
I just kept advocating quietly. I had Jackie Weaver on board originally. She got ill and had to pull out, and then, that changed the finances up. My first choice was Sullivan Stapleton to play Darren Weir, the trainer. So I saw him in a film called Cut Snake and just think, he just has this exquisite emotional availability. He's a big Aussie bloke, buff-haired in his own ways, obviously super handsome. But he wears his heart on his sleeve, and very few Australian men just reveal their heart as, with and a kind of a strange vulnerability.
I thought about you a lot when I knew that the film was in production. I didn't realise it had been completed. And then Darren Weir was in the news and was charged with drug offences and animal cruelty offences. And there was some talk about what does this mean for the film. Was that one of the toughest times for you?
Yeah, look, he hasn't actually been charged with. He's been charged with possession of what's called a horse jigger, which it is illegal to possess. There's no room for jiggers in the Australian horse industry. The fact that he was at the top of his game, was raided and charged, I think, is a testimony to the fact that our industry here says nobody's above the law. Most racing industries around the world self-regulate, and the laws are not state or federal. They are here. So if you transgress a racing law, it's not like the footy code banning you, fining you $25,000 and banning you for 3 years from playing football. This is you are charged criminally, and that is extremely rare. So I think, that's, I don't want to comment too much, but look, I hoped very much that the conversation would not be diverted. I was in no doubt and was reassured that the Melbourne Cup is, impossible to rig, that Michelle would have had to have been involved in that. And
there was never any question.
No,
of her.
And Mark Latham said something absolutely inflammatory last week
Let's not even go
as
there.
he does, which
does.
Basically, he fairly much accused her of participating in criminal rigging. I mean, it's extraordinary.
He's not sure what to do with successful women and accomplished women. They confuse him.
I think I'd like to sit down with Mark one day. I think he has a deep wound. I really do.
Does.
I think and as somebody who carries a deep wound myself, I think I do recognise it sometimes in others.
In the screening that I went to, there was rapturous applause and standing ovations.
You were at the Ritz, were you?
Yeah.
That was beautiful.
It was phenomenal. And some of the others, there have been protesters by animal rights activists. That's obviously something you knew going in, that there were, I would say, a growing movement of discomfort around horse racing. Mm-hmm. And I found myself conflicted because I'm kind of a hashtag nup to the cup. I went to the races once. It wasn't the Melbourne Cup, it was another one, and I felt uncomfortable. But I thought it was one of the best films I've ever seen, and I will be taking my parents and my children, and that feeling of two things being true is an uncomfortable one. But how have you sort of navigated that territory?
Look, I'm extremely comfortable with also holding complex positions on things. I think of I agree with the Australian ethicist, for example, on abortion. I think you don't have to say abortion is not the ending of a life in order to believe that it's a woman's right to make that choice. And that's a very difficult, and I'm, culturally Catholic. I don't believe in any state-sanctioned killing or death penalties, and I, don't believe in murder in war. I believe that women through history have needed and must need to make their own personal choices for their bodies, but I don't have to kind of twist myself into a conundrum of denying that there is a life in order to hold that position. It's very difficult, I think, for some people to hold dualities and complex thoughts. Increasingly, things are louder and more simplistic, and all or nothing. So I respect the right of all protesters. I believe as citizens we should protest for that to which we're passionate.
I have to ask you about your top off.
We'll get there. But look, I think people who care about animals, people who care about horses should stay on top of the data. They should keep the industry at best practice. I think, it's interesting what happened in greyhound racing, that the city must be very careful too about taking a city position on things that are universally, culturally of our country and our countryside. Racing, is a huge job provider. It is culturally where big communities come together on their country cup race days and their picnic race days, where, people come from hundreds of kilometres, thousands of kilometres. When I was in Winton, there were 6 shops in town in Winton. One of them was a frock shop. Half the gear in there was race gear. And that was to go to the Mount Isa Cup, or you're going up to the Darwin races, or you're flying into Doomben. It's a huge part of our countryside's culture of where we come together, and it is where the country comes to the bush. So, look, I think racing, I think the pedal should never be the relief should never be fully off in terms of animal cruelty and rider safety. One beautiful thing, I came up with the idea of Ride Like a Girl because I wanted to reclaim what a girl meant. It is extraordinary that like a girl is still used daily as an insult. And if you go to, boys' schools, it's used all the time. Somebody misses a kick. Oh, kick like a girl. Oh, you're a girl. Oh, you run like
and
a
also
girl.
Just don't be such a girl.
Oh, don't be such a girl. And it's just extraordinary. I mean, if you said that about, any race, it just would be seen as absolutely an unacceptable thing to say. You kick like a, I was going to say kick like a Swede, but that would probably be a compliment. It would just be knowingly an insult. So that girls growing up hearing that, I'm sure they internalise it. So I coined that phrase for our film to reclaim it so that young girls would say to do something like a girl means to win. But when Michelle talks about it, she says she proudly rides like a girl. And for her, it means she'll never be as strong as the guys. So she's not riding with strength. She's not riding with outwilling your horse. She says it's being in tune with the horse. It's riding a lot more softly. It's letting the horse kind of, just get nice and sweet in rhythm and letting the horse breathe and letting the horse feel you being attuned to it. And I think I was just in Western Australia, 80% of incoming apprentices are females, and maybe they're going to ride differently.
You spoke before about how as you get older, you feel more comfortable in your skin. When you famously protested Crown Casino back in whenever it was, you were young, and now there sort of feels like that same black and white approach to whether it's horse racing or the farming industry or politics or whatever it happens to be. How do you sort of manage that without condescending to it, sort of going, I can hold two things at once. It is possible to have complex feelings about things.
For me, I'm the opposite. I unfortunately was born with complex, sometimes unresolvable conundrums. So, no, and look, my position on Crown too was very nuanced. It was, it was about the tender process of how that went down. It was that, the use of that site in Melbourne. It was the introduction of a casino into the centre of a city. I don't mind destination casinos.
How do you look back on that now, on the girl that did that?
I had concerns that the pokies and the amount of machines also kept changing, was preying on our most vulnerable. I am very anti-pokies to this day. I think a lot of, I think it's unfortunate that state governments are dependent on the money that comes from our most vulnerable through gambling. I think it's, we are addicted. State governments are addicted to pokies. I think that's unfortunate. I look back on that girl. Look, I'm proud of her, and I will protest. I've protested it, on other local issues. My protests I tend to be local and human, and they are nuanced.
The through line is passion, though, for you.
I think,
whether it's making this film
Yeah.
or how you felt back then,
Yeah.
it's your passion, a sense of social justice and feminism.
Look, I say I've been a bad feminist, actually. I have not protested enough. But
But
also,
but
I think I've been lazy. I don't think I felt I've had to.
But Rach, being a feminist is not just about what you protest, it's also what you put out in the world. And by putting this film out in the world, that's an extraordinary act of feminism.
Yes, or this might be my making up for being a bad feminist. But I want to tell stories because I think stories can have a much deeper, more profound social impact probably than any protest I'll ever participate in. And, I'm sure there's a lot of people that were shitty that day that I ruined their party. And I know Jeff Kennett walked in and he threw the front page of the Herald Sun onto my cousin Muriel, who was a Victorian politician, and he walked in and threw it on a desk and said, "Can't you control your cousin?" And she said, no one can.
Thank God.
But I do think that the loudest voices don't bring. You have to bring people with you, and maybe I didn't do that, But people like Tim Costello were having those more reasonable conversations. I think it's really important to bring people with you. I think it's really important that the city understands that the issues that the bush are facing and that we don't preach from our comfortable, flexible employment possibilities, that we don't preach, job security and oblivion to other people until you go and spend time in regional Australia, until you know what it's like in these communities that are facing water shortages, land degradation, depressed commodity prices, huge rise in suicide. I don't know how farmers can manage mental health at all, to be honest, because they are absolutely at the hands of the gods, that talk about fear of not being in control, and I'm a control freak. So I think we have to have conversations that are respectful, that are data-based, but also listen to people's stories. And I think particularly us in the city, we've got to be really careful about taking highfalutin positions that we don't understand the impact on the actual lives of people who live outside, a bunch of postcodes.
I heard you say recently that it's a furphy to think that your kids need you the most when they're little, that when they become teenagers, they actually need you a lot more and need you around a lot more. Your kids are how old now?
So 15, 14 and 10.
This has been so all-consuming for such a long time, I imagine.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you about juggling because I hate those questions. But
I would say I didn't.
No.
I'd actually say I didn't juggle. I would just say my husband has been...
Yeah.
I've been like a visitor, occasional visitor. And
do you feel guilty about that? And do your children, are they used to it by now?
Look, I only travel, I try to do an overseas job only once every 18 months, and I try to take at least one child with me, which leaves the workload at home a bit lighter and gives you that lovely opportunity to spend more time. But no, I was really deeply kind of shocked by just how incredibly full-on, adolescence is, and how much your children change, how challenging those changes are. We had a huge health crises with one of my children. I would say in the exact period of shepherding this film, I've never been more worried, for them. So I don't know if it's guilt or just that I felt like I couldn't have actually chosen a worse moment to lead in, because I just was not prepared for how full on adolescence is for them. So I'm having a little cry.
I wanted to ask about the pressure, because I imagine as a director you are the absolute focal point and you're carrying a lot of people, and then at home it's that as well. Do those things have a lot in common?
Yeah, I just think that thing of worrying, of, you can get into those worry cycles. And I certainly got into one where I think I just didn't sleep for about 3 months, which is not healthy. And you just are you promise so much, in those early, as you're pitching to all your investors, you're saying, this is going to be the greatest Australian sports film ever made, and we're going to do the most exciting racing sequences of all time. And then you have that time if you go, you wonder if you're Elizabeth Theranos, in the darkest nights of the soul, you go, I've pulled all this together, I've animated, I brought all these people with me on this journey. Everybody's buying in. And you do go, shit, what if I am Elizabeth Theranos? What if these machines actually don't test blood?
What if I can't pull it off?
What if I can't pull it off? How will I go out into the world? And, it's really interesting, that thing, isn't it, that there's that great statistic that men only have to be 35% confident that they're going to pull something off to give it a crack, and in the meeting go, oh, yep, I'll take it, Brian, I'll head that project up. And then they go to the toilet and shit themselves and go, fuck, how am I going to do that? And then they think who are the smartest people they can bring in to help them get there. But girls apparently have to be 95% confident that they'll pull something off before they'll try. I wouldn't say I was 95, but, I probably, in those moments of believing in the story so much and believing that there's an audience for this story and that it's time for this story and that Michelle's story could be an inspiration to women and men, I probably in the light, in the bonfire of that, was at 85%, with the right team, because it takes a village. So, and Russell had pulled it off, and Simon Baker had pulled it off, and Mel pulled it off, with Mask back in the day.
Yeah.
So I just thought, God, if not now, when? And if not me, who? And I'd rather fail greatly than fail timidly.
Have you exhaled? Because you've done the opposite of fail.
I haven't yet. And I think until to be honest, until the box office receipts come in, as I said, we made this film to be seen and shared by all Australians. We want it to play it in the bush. We want it to play in the country. We want it to play for older men. We want it to play for younger girls. We want women to bring their fathers, their mothers and their daughters and their sons.
It's a true family film. And the other thing that I was so grateful for is that there was no romance storyline, because I've been so conditioned to that. Every time there would be a youngish guy, I'd go, oh, well, here's the one. Here's the guy. And it never transpired. And she had lots of male friends and whatever, but it wasn't about that. The prince was literally the horse.
I know, isn't that beautiful? It's a Disney princess film and the prince is a horse. But I think also Disney princess films are going that way. I think Frozen is a really good example. And I don't know, at the end of Aladdin, does she run off with Aladdin or does she kind of go...
Brave was like that too.
Yeah, Brave was very much like that. So I think, ironically... Disney have done a lot, and I mean, God, Inside Out, how amazing is that all her own antagonists or protagonists are her own, adolescent voices going through puberty. But I do think we now have permission to make amazing stories about women where they're not defined by, who they're dating.
Thank you for telling Michelle Payne's story. Congratulations on the film. It's a masterpiece. If you haven't yet, I am going to beg you to go and see Ride Like a Girl at the movies. It is the best movie I have seen in so many years. Not since the movie Lion did I feel so fantastic about a film that I didn't know if I'd enjoy or not. I'm not big on racing or horse racing. I feel like it's problematic and I don't even, to be honest, like going to the movies that much. But this film is one that I'm going to take my kids to. I'm going to take my parents. I'm going to see it again. It's just phenomenal. This episode of No Filter was produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and you can find me on Instagram at Mia Friedman or sign up for my newsletter at miafriedman.com.au. I'll see you on Mamma Mia.